Hey, thanks for checking out Next Level Carpentry, where Chip is just finishing up cutting up sheets of 3/4 inch particle board coated with melamine into the doors and shelves for some garage storage cabinets that I'm building for a client. Well, I appreciate you getting that taken care of, Chip. Thanks a bunch. Yeah, you're sure welcome. Anytime. As always, I appreciate the help until you're better paid. Take care. Catch you later. With all these parts precisely cut for doors and shelving, it's time to apply the edge banding. Rather than using the iron-on melamine stuff like I did on the front of the cabinet case, I'm going to use this white vinyl T-edge that comes in a box. And while it's just as quick and easy to apply as the iron-on type, it's better looking, in my opinion, and much more durable for this sort of application, especially for use on these garage storage cabinets that tend to get more use and abuse than cabinets in a kitchen or a laundry room. The iron-on stuff is thin and brittle, which is good for many applications, but not this kind of door edging, in my humble opinion. By comparison, T-edge is thicker, tougher, and flexible, which make it ideally suited for edging doors and shelves subject to heavier, rougher use. I'll start by applying the T-edge to the front edge of a few of these shelves to give you a general idea of how this stuff works. The key to success here is in the router bit that's used to cut a slot in the front edge of each shelf for the fin that holds the T-edging firmly and securely in place. In this close-up, you can see the fin that makes this a T has barbs on it to hold it securely in place. This particular molding requires a 2.4 millimeter wide by 1/2 inch deep slot that'll make using a router and this CMT slotting bit. Obviously, it's the carbide teeth on this slotting bit that are 2.4 millimeters thick and create that slot, and the difference in diameter between the guide bearing and the cutting diameter of the slotting bit establishes the slot's 1/2 inch depth. As you'll see, the important thing is to center the slot in the thickness of the material you're applying the T-edge to, which in this case is 3/4 of an inch. To accurately dial in the slot location, chuck the bit in your router and center it with a guess at halfway through the thickness of the material, and do a test plunge cut from each face. If you get it centered the first time, don't waste your money on lottery tickets, because you've just used up all your luck for today. If the two cuts don't line up, just split the difference by raising or lowering the cutter half the difference until they line up perfectly. If it takes you more than 4 tries to get it, we need to talk, because you're about due for a lucky break, and I want in when you go buy lottery tickets. And naturally, since I'm shooting video, this takes me more than 5 times to get the slot dialed in where I want it, so I'm just going to go buy my own lottery tickets. And finally, I got that slot dialed in where it needs to be, so wish me luck on those lottery tickets. With the location of the slot finally dialed in, I'll run a slot all the way along this piece of scrap for demonstration purposes. Since I always use edging that's a little wider than the finished thickness of the material, I'm using 13/16 edging this time for these 3/4 inch thick panels. And you can see in this scrap piece that centering the slot leaves just a little bit of that T-edge to trim on each face for a perfect fit every time. I'll add a special note here that getting the slot right is important. If the slot is too thin for the T-edge you're using, it'll expand the material, flaring the edges and leaving an unacceptable finished product. And of course, if the slot's too loose, the T-edging will just fall out, which isn't acceptable either. As it is, the T-edge should hold firmly in the material without expanding the edge and require only minimal effort to drive into place. And I'm thoroughly satisfied with the setup for this slot, this material, and this T-edging. Now that everything's set up and dialed in just like it needs to be, I can just slide a stack of shelves over here where I can work on them and put a slot in one front edge of each of the shelves. Easy peasy. Because it's important to keep the base of the router steady and flat on the surface of the material that you're slotting, I really like my D-handled router for this work. If you're more accustomed to a router with 2 side handles, you might do well to clamp the pieces down to hold them secure so that the router doesn't tilt as you're making each pass. Because any variation in orientation of the router's base to the surface of the material during the cut will make a slot that's inconsistent and, most likely, too wide. There's one possible remedy to slots that get wallowed out and end up being loose, and that is to add a piece of masking tape to the barb before driving the T-molding into place. But I try to do this step consistently and accurately so that the masking tape solution is only a last resort. And that's all there is to it, which is why I say that this method is just as fast and simple as doing the iron-on variety. And it's probably even faster once you get set up, because these steps go so fast at this stage. Once all the shelves are slotted, I simply cut off pieces of T-edge. They're just a little bit long, maybe an extra ½ inch or inch long, one for each shelf. And I'm using these fast cap flush trim cutters, which work pretty well for this. And once I've got the strips cut, I just put one of the shelves at a convenient working height and then use the ball of my fist to drive the T-edge into the slot on the front edge of that shelf, making sure to let a little bit hang over on each side of the shelf. Well, that's what I do when I'm goofing off for a YouTube audience. But when I'm being responsible, I still put the shelf at a comfortable working height, but then use a rubber mallet to tap that strip into place, starting out with just a little bit hanging over one end, getting the barb started, and then going back, making sure I hit every single inch of the edging along the way. And you know you're done with the job when it's nice and straight. If there's any dips and bumps in there, you didn't pound it in enough times to get it fully seated. Once the T-edge is completely driven in, it's time to trim off the ends flush with the sides of the shelves. Again, you can use the fast cap flush trim snips. Which works pretty well. But the method I prefer, because it leaves a cleaner end cut, is to take a long-handled pipe knife with a brand new sharp blade in it and use that to trim off the end. I flip the shelf over on a piece of scrap wood and then slice off the excess with a firm push. And I don't think you can beat that cut for perfection, even though those flush trim pliers do a pretty fair job. So my opinion, for what it's worth, is that the flush trim snips are faster and pretty good, but the pipe knife is perfection, even though it takes a couple seconds longer. With the edging all driven in and trimmed to length, I've got 2 more steps to do on these shelves before they're done. But I'll take a minute here to ask that you'd consider subscribing to Next Level Carpentry if you haven't already. I like to do detailed, in-depth content like this, even though it kind of makes for longer videos. So if you like that sort of thing, go ahead and subscribe. It's free, and I really appreciate it. I'll also mention that the tools and supplies that you see here in use in this video are available in links through Amazon in the video description below. And anything you buy through those links is the same low online price to you, but Amazon pays me a little bit of the profit instead of sending it all to Jeff Bezos, so I appreciate it. Feel free to take a second to check out other links in the video description where you can get t-shirts like this, Next Level Carpentry swag, a discount on Starbond glue, and there's a place to sign up as a patron through Patreon for the Next Level Carpentry channel. Long format videos with a lot of detail don't necessarily play well for the YouTube algorithm, so it's patrons who go above and beyond for the channel that help make this whole thing work out, and I always appreciate it. Now that I've got that sales pitch out of the way, I'll go ahead and finish these up by trimming the edges. The cool thing is that trimming the edges is even easier than trimming the ends, and I'll use this Verutex edge banding trimmer to do the job. And remember that as long as the T-edge is centered on the panel, there'll be just a little bit to trim off on both of the faces. If there's some variation in that, it doesn't really matter, as long as there's at least a little bit hanging over both edges. I'll zoom way in here so you can see how this works. The edge banding trimmer is designed with a sharp little blade tucked down inside in such a manner that when the tool is pushed along the edge, it shaves off the excess T-edge that sticks above the surface. Quick, slick, and clean. And I think it's pretty sweet how quickly and easily it trims off these little shoelaces of plastic, leaving the edge of the T-edge perfectly flush with the face of the melamine panel. There's pencil marks all over the face of this melamine because I had to do a bunch of additional squaring work on this material because the full sheets that I cut these shelves out of we're out of square to start off with. And just FYI, I did a patron-only video showing the process where I use a joiner for squaring up sheet goods. That's pretty quick and slick, and did an excellent job of making sure all these shelves are exactly the same size and perfectly square. But that sort of extra work leaves the surface a mess. And the good news is a little bit of lacquer thinner on a paper towel cleans off pencil marks like nobody's business. And the T-edge won't soften with that same solvent, so I can clean that off too in the process. And that's all it takes for a durable, clean, nice looking shelf. With edge banding on the shelves all complete, my next job is to do the edge banding for the doors. I've cut 3 panels for upper doors and 3 shorter panels for lower doors. And while the underlying process is the same, there's a few more things involved doing all 4 edges of a panel versus just one straight edge on a shelf like this. But as I hope you expect, I've got a few pro tips that I'll deploy to get the job done and make you successful when you try it. The 2 main challenges you face when doing all 4 edges of a panel versus just one straight edge are the fact that T-edge doesn't like to go around square corners. And even though there's a slot in here, this will just pucker up when it goes around that square corner. And the second thing is, once you've made a lap around the panel, you've got to do a seam or a joint on one of the edges. And getting a precise fit on that joint is a little bit of a trick, but even though I have short sleeves, I've got a trick up my sleeve that makes that a no-brainer. So let's deal with the challenge of puckering corners first. And I'll start out by routing the slot on all 4 edges of the panel. Same thing as before. Make sure you have a steady hand on the router so that the slot doesn't get wallowed out and end up too loose to hold the T-edging in place. Be especially careful at the corners because there's less support surface there and it's easier for the router to tip and spoil the groove. The cool thing is that even though this T-edge puckers going around a square corner, it doesn't take much of a radius for this edging to flow around nice and smooth and clean. So to prevent plastic puckering, I'm going to put a 1/2 inch radius on all 4 corners of each one of these doors using this simple radius template and a flush trim router bit to solve the problem completely. This radius template is as simple and straightforward as can be. I just took a piece of 1/2 inch Russian birch plywood, laid out and shaped a perfect 1/2 inch radius on the corner, and then I glued a couple of stops on 2 of the edges, leaving enough room at the corner for the router's flush trim bit bearing to follow the edge without bumping into those stops. I've got a scrap of the same Russian birch plywood to use as a shim so everything lays flat to make this template work properly. To use this radius template, I simply slip it under one of the door panels on a corner that needs to be rounded off, and then take the scrap of Russian birch and put it somewhere else under the door so that the panel sits flat and the template fits snug on the corner of the door. This is a bottom bearing flush trim bit, and that bearing will ride on the template underneath this piece of 3/4 inch material because I've got the bit depth set to follow the template and cut the door. And this makes putting a 1/2 inch radius on a corner of a door panel like this about as easy, straightforward, and accurate as it can get. How's about that? In use, just make sure the 2 stops are up tight against the 2 edges of the panel for the corner you're rounding, and let the router bit, and template do the work. And now, rounding off all 4 corners is a matter of rinse, lather, repeat. And I call a template like this a fail-safe template because if it moves while the cut is being made, it'll just be undercut and the piece isn't spoiled, so you can just slide the template back where it needs to be and make a final pass. Because with a setup like this, you can't overcut the material and spoil the piece. With that 1/2 inch radius on all 4 corners of the door panel, I can now install the T-edging. And I'll address the second challenge that I talked about before, and that is the splice. When I install the door, I want to put the splice on the least visible side, and in this case, this is the bottom door. I'll put the splice on an edge that will end up at the bottom. And a straightforward approach of cutting a square end on the piece and wrapping it around is extremely difficult to get a nice, tight, clean fit. So I've got a little pro tip here that I'll show you as I start the wrapping process. I'll call this the bottom of the door, and to get a nice clean joint where those two pieces meet, I use a special lapping process, and I start that process by using a sharp utility knife to cut about 3/4 of an inch of the barb off the back of the piece of molding. It doesn't have to be perfectly flush. Now I take that end of the piece, start out about the center of the edge of the door, and tap it into place. Like so. And now you can see when I get to the corner, the piece still wants to pucker because the T-fin gets compressed and has nowhere to go. But the solution for that is almost just as easy as the last bit. I just slip in with a sharp knife and cut out a section of the fin where the molding is going to wrap around the corner. It's helpful to use a very sharp knife for all this stuff. And now with that T-barb off the back, the molding will follow right around that 1/2 inch radius. I put a little extra pressure to pull the molding this way so that the corner pulls nice and tight, and you can see it do that there. Just like that. I continue to keep pressure going this direction on the molding as I hammer it in along this edge. That assures that the vinyl will stay tight on that small radius. I make sure the molding is driven in snug, tight, and completely all the way along the edge, and then I just trim away that back fin at the second corner in the same manner as the first. And I just continue on around the door panel using these same techniques until I get back around to the end where I started so I can complete the splice. Some of you might be wondering why I rounded the slot before I rounded the corners. And the reason is that it leaves just a little bit more meat on the inside of that radius corner. I don't need the clearance of the slot for the T-spline, and I think it makes the corner just a little stronger. Anyways, that's what I tell myself when I go through the process this way. Truth be told, if you route the spline after the corners are radiused, I don't think anybody is ever going to know the difference. And that brings me full circle, but I guess that's actually full rectangle, back to where I started. But now I can complete this splice with a little more magic. First, I cut off excess T-molding, leaving enough length on the second piece so that it overlaps the first piece by 1/4 inch or so. Make that a 1/2 inch. And now I'll just trim away that spline so that this second piece clears the first piece when it's tapped into the slot. Just like that. What? That splice looks lousy, you say? Ah yes, and I agree, but I'm not done yet. For demonstration purposes, I've clamped the door down to the work surface so that I can finish this up. And I'll grab that long-handled pipe knife once again and cut through both pieces of edging, right where they overlap. And notice I'm putting about a 10-degree angle on the blade and trying to keep it square to the faces of the door. There I've simply tapped through both pieces so that I can lift away the front piece, tuck the two ends precisely together, and tap it home for an almost invisible splice. Once I remove the black smudge marks from that rubber mallet, that is. And finishing up a splice like that wraps up the magic part of the show, even though I've got a little more work to do in trimming the edges off of both faces of this door. I'll put a link in the video description to an edge trimmer that they make that's specifically for this T-edge, and the main feature of it is that it goes around these sharp corners better than this one that I use for the melamine edge banding. But to prove a point, I'll show you that this type of edge band trimmer works, as does the older version of the Virutex trimmer that I've used in other videos. It's a little tricky getting around those tight corners with this tool's design. So if you have trouble, you can always use an old plane iron or a sharp chisel to make that cut around the corner. But regardless of your tool of choice, I like to start by the splice on the end just to get the cut going, and then just carefully go around that edge corner, that corner. That one didn't do so well, And I can just clean it up with this plane iron. Simple as that. And then continue down the side and awkwardly around the next corner to trim the end. And you can see the shorter nose on this older tool does a better job of getting those rounded corners cleaned up than this different design on the new tool. And as long as I have a sharp plane iron as a backup, I'm assured that all the corners will come out perfectly. And once I've got the technique down, I'm all set up and rolling. It just takes seconds to flush trim that long white shoelace off the perimeter of this door. And maybe someday, when I've got a job that has 20 doors instead of 6, I'll spring for that dedicated T-edge trimmer and see if it actually makes a difference for speed or quality, or if it just ends up cluttering up a drawer and never getting used again. Well, I guess I might as well finish this up the way it started, with Chip working and me yakking, and say that I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, until next time, thanks for watching. Well, Chip, I appreciate you wrapping that up for us here, and hope you don't have to work too late, but I'm going to call it a day. See how he is? Oh well, I guess there's got to be some perk for being the boss. Huh. Looks like you're still here. Well, so am I. So in order to thank you for watching this video to the end of the end of the end, I'm going to show you where I get the sawdust, aka guy glitter, that I keep in this bucket. Longtime viewers of the Next Level Carpentry channel know that I use this stuff along with a sharpened putty knife for cleaning up glue squeeze out when I'm gluing up projects, instead of using wet rags and warm water to remove the glue, which only makes a mess of things. But what you might not know is that all sawdust is not created equal. And as a true connoisseur of sawdust, I can tell you that there's none better than the sawdust you get when you're cutting particle board. You've heard of twice baked potatoes? Well, think of this as twice cut sawdust, like the pile of stuff I have here from cutting all those shelves. Notice that I just let it pile up here on the floor under the saw to maintain its consistency, which would get lost if I suck it up with the Gyro Air G700 dust processor and remove it from the bins. And that's something only a true aficionado can appreciate. As you can see, I take full advantage of a cabinet project like this one to refill buckets of sawdust that tide me over until the next time I have a particle board project in the shop. I grab my favorite swapped fine bristle shop broom and my no stoop dust scoop to clean up the mess and restock my sawdust buckets. As you can plainly see, it makes a lot of extra mess in the shop to gather up sawdust like this, and I need to wear a mask while cutting, but to me it's well worth the extra effort in how well sawdust works for cleaning out glue squeeze out when compared to warm water and wet rags. And now, you know my source for official sawdust, and I can end this video for sure this time. Catch you later.